morning. Welcome to Talkin It Out. This is the inaugural broadcast of the radio ministry brought to you by Niles, Philadelphia, Seventh-day Adventist Church. I'm your host, Russell Murnahan. Before we get to the meat of what we're doing here this morning, I want to tell you a little bit about my story. I was born and raised in Portland, Oregon. I had a family that was not very religious. And as I was growing up, I didn't think too much about spiritual things, about the larger questions of life. And, as somebody who is exposed to really only things like that through media, I didn't have a lot of understanding of things like what the Bible says. So when I was growing up, I had a few encounters that made a difference to me. But perhaps the largest influence that I had when I was growing up was the influence one particular faithful night when I was sitting doing my homework in high school. I was a kid who was very good at procrastinating. Turns out not much has changed over the years. But as I was sitting, supposed to be doing my homework at some degree of efficiency, I was listening to the radio. This was in the days before proliferation of things like Spotify. So I was listening to a live radio station. And I was listening to my preferred music, Rock 101 KUFO. And it had gone to a commercial break, as it did so often. And curiously, although I realize now providentially, instead of waiting for the commercial to end or just turning it down, I decided to surf up and down the dial looking for something else. And I wasn't sure what, because I had other radio stations that I liked. There were certainly other things I could have turned to that I had thought about. But I just started seeking up and down the dial. And what I landed on was 93.7 KPDQ. This is in Portland, Oregon still. And what I heard is something that I had never heard before. And that was people who were calling into this radio station and who were sharing what was going on in their lives, sharing where they were at, and getting advice. They were asking questions and being blessed by what the Christian radio hosts had to share. They were getting Bible answers, they were getting guidance and advice, and they were being prayed with. And that was very new to me as somebody who had never thought seriously or practically about spiritual things in a large way up until that point. There's a lot more of my story than I could tell you, but I think it's relevant this morning to say that one of the reasons that I'm here is to extend a similar opportunity to whoever is out there to know a little bit more about spiritual things, about who God is, about what he wants for our lives, about what it says in his word, the Holy Bible. And so what we're doing here today is taking an opportunity to share, something we intend to do from week to week in the coming months. And the larger structure of what we want to do here is open up the Bible, answer questions. And so we're going to give you an opportunity to do just that. If you would like to send in something, to have a question answered, to get advice, to have prayer, then that's going to be something that you're going to be able to do with us in the coming weeks. But first, I want to tell you a little bit about the church that's bringing this to you. It's a church where I'm a member. In fact, I'm serving as an elder there. It's the Niles, Philadelphia Seventh-day Adventist Church. It was founded in 1962, moved to its current location on US 12 in 2016, and it is a place that I call my spiritual home. When I first walked into this building about a year and a half ago, I was struck by how loving and kind and friendly everybody was there. And it was a very quick decision to say, this is where I'm going to be fellowshipping from now on. Something about the name I would like to mention. It sounds odd to think of a church in Niles, Michigan as also being a Philadelphia church. But some people may not know that Philadelphia is not just a city in Pennsylvania. Some may know that Philadelphia is Greek and means brotherly love. But we first hear about Philadelphia in the Bible. There is a passage in the book of Revelation, chapter 3, that talks about the church of Philadelphia. You see, the beginning of the book of Revelation has letters from Jesus to specific churches. We're not going to get into all those letters today, but just giving you some context for why the church is named Philadelphia. Revelation chapter 3 begins the letter to the church of Philadelphia, and you get a sense of what Jesus is doing as he introduces himself to the church and as he describes the church. It begins this way: "And to the angel of the church in Philadelphia write, These things says he that is holy, he that is true, he that has the key of David, he that opens and no man shuts, and shuts and no man opens." This is how Jesus identifies himself to the church of Philadelphia. He does this to each of the 7 churches in a unique way every time. But then he describes something about this church, and I think you'll catch why it is that our church is named this. "I know your works," he says. Jesus tells us he knows what we're like and what we do, what our behavior is, which can either be good news or bad, depending on his role in our life. He continues, "Behold, I have set before you an open door, and no man can shut it." In other words, Jesus is saying, I'm giving you something special. There's an opportunity ahead of you. I believe that's something we're doing here this morning. But then he says, "For you have a little strength." This is kind of an odd thing to tell somebody, but it's a commendation of the fact that their strength is not in themselves. See, one of the core Bible truths is that we draw our strength from God, not just from within. It's not just something that happens at the gym on the weight bench. It's something that happens in a higher spiritual way and that Jesus supplies for us. So when we recognize that our strength is little and that his strength is great, that is a good place to be. So it sounds like a put down, but Jesus telling us that we have a little strength is actually a compliment. He says, "For you have a little strength and have kept my word and have not denied my name." So this is the Philadelphia church, this group of people who are relying on Jesus, who have kept his word, and who have not denied his name. That's a goal I have in my heart, and it's one of the things I like about the Philadelphia church here in Niles, Michigan. So we're formally inviting you to come join us. If you are interested in a new place to come fellowship, to learn about God, to know more about his Bible, and to have some great food here and there, we're going to invite you to join us at 33332 US 12 in Niles, Michigan. It's on US 12 between the official city of Niles and Edwardsburg, 33332 US 12. We have Bible study Saturday mornings at 10:30 a.m. and our worship times at 11:30 a.m. and often a meal to follow. We're inviting you to come join us. We're going to talk a little bit more about why services are on Saturday in a moment. But I first wanted to talk about why it is that we're calling this Talking It Out. And I have, perhaps as the best reason, a quote from the book of Isaiah chapter 1, verse 18. Isaiah tells us, "In the words of the Lord to his people, come now and let us reason together, says the Lord." There's a beautiful chapter that's happening here where God is confronting his people. But instead of just taking them to task, he finishes by saying, let's work through this. One way to translate this was, let's have a dispute, let's argue this out. But I like the way it puts it in the King James. Let us reason together. God is interested in us thinking with him through the things of our lives, and this is what we want to be doing as part of this show. So we are going to be taking questions to answer some of the difficult questions of your life. And so what I have begun to do before I solicit questions from you is to gather them from a few people at church, something that they thought would be a blessing to share for the wider community. So I've got a few of those questions here today. But we're interested to have your questions, to have your, if you're seeking advice, if you're desiring prayer, go ahead and reach out to us. Now, you have an email to be able to do that. That's npsdacommunications@gmail.com. So that's an abbreviation for Niles Philadelphia Seventh-day Adventist. Again, that email is npsdacommunications@gmail.com. We're looking forward to taking your questions and praying for you in the weeks to come. But let's begin with the questions we already have. The first one that somebody submitted: what does the Bible say about God as creator? It's an excellent question. And I like to begin at the beginning for this kind of question. You'll see more why I've picked this. Genesis chapter 1, verse 1. The Bible opens with a very simple set of words, and they are, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth." And what I like to draw from this is that the Bible opens with a given that God exists and that he has made the world in which we live. The Bible just takes that as the state of things. It doesn't try to argue about why or how or whether that's the case. It just presents it as true. And it's not only in the New Testament that we see this. Jesus himself also thought of God as creator. In the book of Mark, chapter 10, we hear him in a dispute with some people about the issue of divorce. We're not going to talk about that today, although it's a topic that matters to me. Mark chapter 10, verse 6, Jesus tells us the following: "But from the beginning of the creation, God made them male and female. For this cause shall a man leave his father and mother and cleave to his wife, and they twain," or both, "shall be one flesh. So they are no more twain," or two, "but one flesh." Jesus is working towards a larger point here about the meaning of marriage. But what is important to recognize is that it was a given for Jesus that the gospel is founded in this idea that God is creator, that there is a real bedrock truth to the book of Genesis and the story that it tells us about God making everything that we are and that we see. He also explains the origins of marriage. They weren't just something that happened in society over time as we decided that coming together and joining long-term monogamous relationships was beneficial to the tribe. He indicates this was something that God instituted. So to the question, what does the Bible say about God as creator? I think the first thing that it tells us is that he is creator. So there's a lot of people that wonder about how this world came to be, about where we came from, and there's a lot of questions tied up with that. You think about where you come from, it should tell you something about your purpose. It should tell you something about where you're going and what matters, values. And so if we begin with this idea that God does exist, which Hebrews makes clear requires faith to believe, but if we begin with this idea that God exists and that he has made us, made everything that we know, everything that we care about, then that changes the way that we think, changes the way that we live our lives. And so I want to make it clear that the Bible treats this idea as a given, both in the Old Testament and in the New, from the words of Jesus himself. But there's some other things that God is trying to indicate through his word about being the creator. And I'm going to move forward to one more point, which is related to the church. Genesis chapter 2, the next chapter of the story of creation, begins this way, verse 1. "Thus the heavens and the earth were finished, and all the host of them." So after going through the 6 days of creation and telling us the different things that happened on those days, for example, day 1 being light, all the way through day 6 with the creation of animals and human beings, it then tells us something happened after the 6th day. Verse 2, "And on the 7th day, God ended his work which he had made, and he rested on the 7th day from all his work which he had made." Now, it's perhaps obvious to you, as it is obvious to most people reading this story, that God doesn't get tired. The book of Isaiah chapter 40 actually tells us that explicitly. But it's almost obvious. He did not get tired from his work of creating, so then why did he rest? And it gives us a good idea in verse 3. "And God blessed the seventh day and sanctified it. That is, he made it holy, or he set it apart, because that in it he had rested from all his work which God created and made. I think one of the best reasons why God rested from his work was to be an example for us. Whereas he does not get tired, we do. So he was giving us a pattern of being able to have not just the excuse, but the permission, the blessing to be able to take time off. So this is how the Bible introduces a fundamental concept called the Sabbath. It's a time of resting. One of the best known places the Sabbath is talked about besides the story of creation is in the Ten Commandments. If you're not familiar with the Ten Commandments, this is the story in the book of Exodus of God giving his laws, his principles of life to his people after they're recovering from a time of slavery in Egypt. And as these 10 principles, these 10 commandments are given, written on stone and delivered to his servant Moses, one of the perhaps lesser focused commandments is the fourth, which reads the following in Exodus chapter 20, beginning in verse 8. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. And so this is a reminder for us throughout our lives to keep one day separate, different, and in rest. And it goes on, verse 9, 6 days shall you labor and do all your work. Verse 10, but the seventh day is the Sabbath of the Lord your God. And so he's just telling us that there is an opportunity for us to come aside and to rest and to follow the example that he gave us in creation, to stop what we're doing and to enjoy time with him, time with one another, time enjoying the things that he's made, everything from good food to good nature. And it also tells us in the rest of the commandment how we're supposed to do that. It continues, in it you shall do no work, you, nor your son, nor your daughter, your manservant, nor your maidservant, nor your cattle, nor the stranger that is within your gates. So it's not just a mandate for God's people directly to rest, but to everyone that they're connected to, their family members, their employees, even their animals, and yes, even those among them who do not count themselves believers in the same way. The stranger, it calls them, your guests, right? And the idea is it's not just something for you, it's something to be shared in community, which I think is beautiful. And it continues in verse 11, the reason why this principle has been set forward in the Ten Commandments in such a stark way. In other words, the reason this is the case, in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea and all that in them is, and rested the seventh day. Wherefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it, or made it holy. So the reason I bring this up is because you might be wondering what it means to be a Seventh-day Adventist. What is a Seventh-day Adventist church? And I'm answering the first part of that question. One of the fundamental things tied up with the Bible story of creation is the Sabbath. And so we believe as Seventh-day Adventists that this time of rest that God has instituted at creation, he reaffirmed in the Ten Commandments, and which Jesus honored in his lifetime on this earth, is something that still matters today. To take that time to spend with him, to spend with one another, to reconnect, to rest, to be refreshed. So the first part of Seventh-day Adventists is an emphasis on this rest that has been so often forgotten by many believers and throughout time. This is the reason our services are offered on Saturday. Without getting far into the issue, if you consider just about any calendar, you'll find that the week begins on Sunday and it ends on Saturday. Saturday is, in fact, the seventh day of the week, something I did not know when I was growing up, and is the time on which God has set aside for us to rest. So it's a good opportunity for us to get together and worship. Worship can happen on other days of the week. That is absolutely appropriate, but there's something special about this hallowed, this sanctified time that God has set apart. So that's the first part of what it means to be a Seventh-day Adventist. And I want to talk about the next part by answering perhaps unexpected question, and that is, Number 2, why does God allow suffering and pain? Now, I don't want to diminish the weight of this. This is perhaps one of the greatest questions that human beings ever ask. There is an entire branch of philosophy and theology dedicated to this question. It's called theodicy. Theodicy is a Greek term that means the justice of God. And it takes 3 ideas seriously and tries to make sense of them. That is, 1, that God is all-powerful, 2, that God is loving, and that 3, evil exists. How is it that all those 3 things can be true at the same time? If God is able to do whatever he wants, and he loves his children, why doesn't he do away with the evil that has caused them so much difficulty, suffering, and pain? Well, if he can't do something about it, that means he must not be all-powerful. And if he doesn't want to do something about it, then he must not be good. And I don't think anybody's going to argue that there is no such thing as evil, suffering, and pain. So then what can you do? What can you say? There are certainly lots of things that you could go to in the Bible to try and answer this question. There's an entire book dedicated to it, the book of Job, which we're not going to address today. But my favorite, I think, to answer this question in a very beginning, a very early fashion, is the book of Matthew chapter 13. I'm going to read a parable that Jesus gives us there. Matthew chapter 13, beginning in verse 24. Another parable put he forth unto them, saying, The kingdom of heaven is likened unto a man which sowed good seed in his field. But while men slept, his enemy came and sowed tares, or weeds, among the wheat, and went his way. But when the blade was sprung up and brought forth fruit, then appeared the tares also. So the servants of the householder came and said to him, Sir, didst not thou sow good seed in thy field? From whence then hath it tares? Why in the world, they say, are there weeds in your field? He said to them, An enemy has done this. The servants said to him, Will you then that we go and gather them up? They ask a reasonable question. Should we go get rid of all these weeds if they're not from you? But he said, Nay, lest while you gather up the tares, you root up also the wheat with them. He says something heavy. Let both grow together until the harvest. And in the time of harvest I will say to the reapers, Gather ye together with first the tares, and bind them in bundles to burn them, but gather the wheat into my barn. Now, if the themes of this weren't entirely clear, let's let Jesus explain them as he does just a few verses later when his disciples approach him, beginning in verse 36. Then Jesus sent the multitude away, and went into the house, and his disciples came unto him, saying, Declare unto us the parable of the tares of the field. So they came to Jesus, and they said, You've been teaching a lot, you've been telling a lot of parables, but we have a particular interest in this one. This one struck a chord for us, and we want to know what you have to say about it. And this is one of the most straightforward and clear descriptions Jesus ever gave, explaining one of his parables. Verse 37, He answered and said to them, He that soweth the good seed is the Son of Man. So what he's doing is he's going through the elements of this story, and he is telling us exactly what they represent. So the person that was sowing the seed, putting the seed into the field, is Jesus, the Son of Man, as he often referred to himself. Verse 38, the field is the world. So he's telling us these are where the seeds are being planted. Okay, makes sense. The good seed are the children of the kingdom, but the tares are the children of the wicked one. So Jesus says that those that are good are the good seed, and those that are from the wicked one are the tares. Now, it's natural to think that he's talking about just humans, but of course, humans are not the only intelligent beings throughout the universe. If we're going to take the Bible seriously, as we do here at Talkin It Out, then we also have to acknowledge things like angels or demons, who are also clearly represented in both the Old and New Testaments as forces, as beings, as real things in the world. And if we're going to take the rest of the Bible seriously, we're also going to know that it turns out that there is more than just human beings, angels and demons, living in the universe. In fact, Hebrews chapter 1 talks about God who made the worlds. That's plural. that's something to talk about perhaps for another day. And so when he's talking about the good seed and the tares, he's talking about good beings and bad beings, whether they're humans or not. And then he continues, verse 39, the enemy that sowed them is the devil. The harvest is the end of the world, and the reapers are the angels. So when he's wrapping up this idea in this parable, he tells us that there is such a thing as a devil, and that he does plant bad things, bad people in the lives around good people. But he also tells us that there is an end to the world. And we're not talking about some disaster movie end of the world. It's going to be the way the Bible describes it, something that we perhaps can explore another time. But he lets us know the world is coming to an end, and this is part of the answer that he's giving us about the solution to evil, pain, and suffering. He says, verse 40, as therefore the tares, again the weeds, are gathered and burned in the fire, so shall it be in the end of this world. The Son of Man shall send forth his angels, and they shall gather out of his kingdom all things that offend, and them which do iniquity or evil, and shall cast them into a furnace of fire. There shall be wailing and gnashing of teeth. Then shall the righteous shine forth as the sun in the kingdom of their Father. Who has ears to hear, let him hear. So what Jesus is doing is telling us that there is such a thing as evil and evil beings in the universe. But one of the most important things that he tells us is that God did not make them. He says an enemy has done this. This brings into the question, well, how did the devil get here? How did the demons get here? But what's clear is that God is not, according to this parable, responsible for that. That is an important question to delve into another time, but we're just taking the parable as it comes. Jesus tells us that there is a responsibility for evil in this world, and it's not on God's shoulders. He also tells us that part of the answer is that the way things are now is not how they will always be. If we were going to dive more deeply into the idea of the wrapping up of all things, we'd go naturally to the book of Revelation, also to those who know, to the book of Daniel in the Old Testament about how things are going. But what it means is that there is going to be a judgment, a final reckoning, where everybody will get good or evil based on the kind of person they have been. And so what this does is it lets us know that things aren't always going to be the way they are. That God is not responsible for the beginning of evil in our lives and in our experience, but he will be responsible for taking care of it once and for all. I think that's a beautiful thing to look forward to. And so if you're wondering, what does it mean to be a Seventh-day Adventist? We talked about seventh day and the Sabbath. And an Adventist means somebody who cares for, who wants, who's looking forward to the return of Jesus to this earth. Not the first time, because he already did that in the Christmas story, but the second time. The second advent, the return of Jesus Christ to the earth, where he will begin the process of taking care of evil once and for all. So these are the kinds of things we're trying to explore together. If you have questions of your own you would like us to answer together, then I'm going to invite you once more to send in those questions. That email again is npsdacommunications@gmail.com. npsdacommunications@gmail.com. Again, Niles, Philadelphia, Seventh-day Adventist, hence the letters that come in that email there. And what I'd like to do, one last thing before we finish our time, is to pray with you. Let's do that. Dear God, I just want to thank you so much for everyone hearing the sound of my voice. I ask, Lord, that you would bless them with the things that you know that they need. I thank you that you've brought them to hear and to listen to what you have to say in your word, and that you grant them something special because they opened their ears today. May you open their heart in the same way. And may you bless this journey to continue to seek from your word the most important answers to questions that we have in our lives. In Jesus' name we pray it and thank you. Amen. Well, this is it. This has been the first episode of Talkin It Out. We hope to hear from you with your questions, your prayer requests, those things that you can send in that email. And until next time, God's blessings.